I want to welcome everybody to our Chevron Forum on supply chain localization. I really appreciate Chevron sponsoring this. I think it's an add-on or follow-on to an important report that was done in May of 2012 called Maximizing Development of Local Content Across Industry Sectors in Emerging Markets. Very long title, but important report, shorter report than the title, but really important, by my good friend Michael Levitt, and also co-authored by Ashley Chandler, but also a number of really thoughtful people were involved with it. I was at Walmart a month ago, and several people there referenced the report, so it still cycles through and is a perennial. But I think one of the reasons we wanted to do this conversation is we think the world is changing for sort of supply chains across a number of different industries. And I think both the report needs a refresh, but I think we need to look at this in a more profound way. So I don't see this as sort of a one-off. I see this as sort of something that we need to be doing on an extended basis and looking at across a number of different industries. So I hope you'll stay tuned and bear with me as we do this. But I wanted to take advantage of this window. Several people were in town and the planets aligned, and so I wanted to convene this to kind of get this started. We've got some very thoughtful people here, but we also have some really thoughtful people in the audience. I see my friend Santiago Sadaka, who's here. Thanks for being here. But also, there's just a number of very thoughtful people here. But the other thing I want to just reference is when we did there were many important things I took out of the commission that we did on development that Joanna Nesseth and I co-led. One of them was some of the thoughtful things that Runde Zygaki had to say about the power of Chevron's buying power and in local economies. But it was also echoed by my good friend Paula Luff, who was also a commission member on the role of extractives. So I think that has stayed with me, and I think we'll have a chance to kind of unpack that a little bit more. The other thing that I just wanted to share was when we said we want to talk about the extractive sector, we want to talk about agriculture, we want to talk about the changing landscape. It's very interesting. We put this out. I got some internal flack in the building saying, why are you doing this? We hate local content. There's industries that hate local content, and we, the United States, are pursuing a WTO challenge against Indonesia for exactly this reason. So why do you like this local content stuff? So I think that's a legitimate position as well, and so it kind of depends on where you sit, that this issue, but I will just tell you that the landscape is changing. There's a whole series of drivers. I think we're going to have a chance to unpack it. So I won't go into detail on everybody's bio here, but we've got some very thoughtful folks. I'm going to turn it over first to my friend Paula Luff, who's with Hess, to kick off the conversation, then we'll take it from there. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for braving the rain and making it here this afternoon. I guess for me, I work for an oil company smaller than my colleagues at Chevron, but local content really isn't an optional thing for us. It's baked into contracts. We're often required to build infrastructure, source goods and services locally, achieve a certain level of workforce localization within a time certain. And so it's typically required by contract and increasingly by regulation. We, for example, like Pyxera, have a presence in Ghana. We are in early stages. And Ghana passed a local content law a few years ago that, frankly, we wouldn't be able to meet in the United States. It's great. I think the spirit of the law is important. Ghana wants to make sure that they realize all of the development potential that oil and gas development could potentially create and prosperity for the country. But it's a new industry, and in order to achieve the level that the government would love to see happen, it's going to take a lot of work. And typically, in the supply chain world, our supply chain colleagues, even if they're sympathetic to the idea of sourcing goods and services locally, building local economies, they simply aren't equipped to do that. They're trained, to go out and get bids, looking at perhaps environment, health, and safety metrics, and vetting for that, or vetting for certain kinds of background checks with security providers, for example. But the idea of not just kind of going to the best bidder and signing a contract, but actually having to maybe invest in capacity building and helping build small and medium-sized enterprises, at least their capabilities to work with us and potentially even provide some debt or equity financing, right? Is something that they're not set up to do. And yet I think that is kind of where we have to go. If we're truly going to achieve sustainable development and meet the sustainable development goals, we can't just do it through bilateral funds transfers or PPPs, which are all great and have achieved wonderful things, but really to bring those SDGs to scale and to make them stick and really lift people out of poverty into prosperity, it's going to take all of the tools of the core of particularly the private sector, and that includes our core business.
Yeah. Deirdre, thanks for being here. You were telling me about how Pyxera, which used to be known as CDC and Citizen Development, fell into this 20 years ago. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that's evolved since then?
Sure. So the part of this we work on is exactly what Paula was just referring to, which is our core expertise is developing local capacity. So where the oil companies are saying this is not our core abilities to build the capacity of these local companies, it is very much ours. And we started this work about 20 years ago now in Sakhalin in Russia, where we actually were working under a USAID-funded standard SME development program. And really the only opportunity we saw to link local businesses to opportunities to grow was to link them to the oil industry as suppliers. So we developed or sort of dabbled in developing some expertise and understanding the industry way back then. We subsequently put in a bid for a program in Azerbaijan where we actually did build into our program proposal the idea that we would work somewhat with the oil and gas industry. So it was an anticipated piece of the project, but we didn't realize how much it would really take over what we were able to do with the SME sector in Azerbaijan. And interestingly from there, so the first 10 years, everything we did in this space was funded by USAID, either intentionally or unintentionally. From there, BP, who became one of our partners in Azerbaijan, said, hey, can you recreate this Azerbaijan thing in Angola? And we went over to Angola and collaborated also with Chevron and Total and Exxon and Senegal, the state oil company there, and really developed what I just referred to as the gold standard model with this cross-company collaboration where everyone was invested financially and everyone was also invested in providing access to opportunities for local businesses. And I think it's fair to say that that program exceeded everyone's expectations in terms of the contracts that were able to go to local businesses. And then just fast forwarding a little bit further, we've done programs for single oil companies, all IOCs, no national oil companies to date, but in a number of countries. And what's happened in Ghana today, the reason we're in Ghana is actually we're funded there by USAID, fully by USAID, because USAID decided to step in where the IOCs had not yet taken that step. We were already well past first oil. There's still no local content program in place. And so AID said we're going to step in and fill this gap. And the last thing I would say about that is they did it in a really important way, which is that they did it through a grant. It's not a cooperative agreement, it's not a contract, and so it allows this incredible flexibility of the program to really adapt to what's going on in the industry and what's changing there.
Do you think over time that the industry itself will pick that up? And once you kind of that with that, is that glue money to get something started?
We hope so. I think that there's this dance that goes on, and Paula, you would probably agree.
I've been dancing it.
There's a dance that goes on where the IOCs say that's government's job. That's the local government's job to train businesses and to train people to be able to serve the industry. And correctly so to some extent. But if the IOCs sit and wait for the local governments to do that, they can just pass out from holding their breath. So, I hope that what will happen in Ghana is a pickup and a takeover of this program. What we haven't seen that yet. What we have seen is other countries IOCs operating in other countries like Uganda come in and say, oh, wow, this looks great. Can you help us do this in Uganda? So even if it serves as a model, that's a victory in of itself.
Can you just talk just briefly about the mining sector? Do you work at all with mining companies?
We do. The problem is the supply chain is just not as deep or broad for mining companies, so the opportunities are not as extensive. Programs can be much more limited, or I think they have to take into a part a larger community development effort that may involve training local governments how to spend royalties and things that go beyond the SME development. We have done some work, I think you remember back in Guatemala, where we were working on very low-level suppliers to the industry. I know. Sort of, filling out the cafeterias more than the really more sophisticated services that are, that are available. At the build stage, more opportunity. At the operation stage, much less opportunity.
Great. Bob, thanks for being here. ACDI VOCA. You've been there since as a child prodigy. You started at the age of 4, and now you're 26 years later.
The 26 years is great.
26, great. So talk about how there's all sorts of changes in the agricultural space that we were talking about upstairs, and talk a little bit about how that's changing your business.
Okay, I kind of look back. I can chunk it into 3 basic chapters. If I think back earlier when I first started with ACDI, it's easier to keep track of our names. We were ACDI and VOCA, and we became ACDI VOCA. But when I first started with ACDI, we really were working in the development space. And we had our universe, which to corporate buyers was just a black box that every so often suitable supply would pop up and they'd be willing to buy it. Often not on a strong relationship basis, but on a transactional basis. And that was a sign of success of a lot of work, which to them was perceived as a black box. And similarly for us, we didn't engage them that fully except at that possibility to purchase. Chapter 2 is where we drew them in more to our projects. They started to see a little bit more value to predictability, to reliable supply, and they would join as stakeholders. Every so often, if they liked what they saw, they would subsidize part of the development work that we were involved in. The piece on the Success Alliance that's in the last report probably falls into that category where there was some funding. At other times, we'd have groups saying, we'd like to enter into that market a bit. If we piggyback onto this project, we can get a little bit of lowering our cost of entry, a little bit of subsidy. So it was a little bit of a cross-subsidy area. But I think it grew richer towards the end as we started to say, we need these folks to be more active stakeholders. We need greater engagement with the exporters, with the processors, with we were generally working with the cooperatives and the associations and the folks that aggregated the smallholders as well as the smallholders. And we also need to really understand the rules of the game and what's driving the decisions of the international buyers. And we developed with AID, under a couple of contracts, some thought pieces around the value chain approach that AID employed in its work, and the market systems approach. And it fed into our projects, and we were working more routinely and deeper, but we're still kind of viewing our world as this is how we'll get the most mileage on our development project. More recently, we're seeing an increased interest by the international corporations and by larger players in the local economy to really engage, to look at can they buy our services outside the context of a development project? Can they buy smaller services? We've gone in and we think we've done everything right. We're offering what we view as a fair market price. Why are the producers fleeing from our product line? And being able to have the perspective and the local knowledge that says, well, you've hitched yourselves to a middleman that is known for having ineffective scales. We all might like that when we go to the doctor's office. We don't like it when we're selling coffee or cocoa or whatever. And being able to, we're starting to appreciate more deeply that we could work together in a different way from the donor-funded development project. What's driving that? It's probably partly we're seeing this kind of social license concept that was more important for for folks who go in with oil or mining agreements with the government. But it's also coming, it's from both sides on the supply and the demand. It's not just countries putting requirements down, but it's every whole food shopper looking at what type of abuse or what type of exploitation might be in the supply chain, and needing to be able to understand better what are those local dynamics. Last year, Coffee Quality Institute reached out to us and said, given your experience with coffee producers, we'd like you to come on board and help us build a partnership for gender equity. Their stakeholders said, it's really important for us to understand the dynamics. Coffee and cocoa like it, with climate change, with increasing demands, it has a threat around the supply. And if the local communities that are producing it do not recognize benefits, don't have the incentives to continue producing it, they've got a major crisis on their hands. So this notion of reliable supply has really grown into a driver of sustainable supply, and that has social elements to it, it has fairness elements to it, it has environmental elements to it, all things that really are manifest at the local level.
Could you just talk a little bit about the increasing demands for traceability through supply chains? I get the sense that consumers are saying, I want to know, where does this bean come from? And it's actually fairly hard. It's not, right? I mean, I think that's a fair statement. And so there have been a lot of commitments by a number of companies saying, I'm gonna have traceability by such and such a date, or some, various companies have made those sorts of commitments. Could you talk a little bit about how hard is that, and talk a little bit more about what's driving that?
No, I'm not an expert on what goes into place with traceability, but I do know it's an issue. And there are some technologies out there that could make it much more cost effective, but they're not necessarily well known or broadly applied. And being able to look at those that do work and can get it down to the last mile would probably be a worthwhile investment from a developmental perspective. I think, without that, the ability to provide the level of traceability that people imagine that they really need is going to limit the engagement to larger providers, larger producers who are more plugged in. And reaching down to the smallholder is more difficult. So really being able to get those systems in place that would make that cost effective. And really, without it, it probably puts in question the effectiveness of even the traceability back to the larger, because there's a strong pressure to buy from the local folks who aren't necessarily being traced. So it becomes complex to the extent that you're dealing with traceability, to the extent that you're dealing with certifications, and once you put any game in place, unless it's relatively deep, there's ways to game the system.
Thank you. Alejandro, thanks for being with us. Really appreciate it. Inter-American Development Bank, great multilateral development bank, and you work for, I think, one of the most interesting parts of the multilateral system, the Multilateral Investment Fund. It's highly flexible grant and investment instrumentalities set up in 1992 by, I think, the United States and a whole series of other donors. And you work to specifically work with the private sector in Latin America. And so your focus at the MIF is to work on a broad variety of supply chains. So thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
So how does the IDB look at this? How does the MIF look at this? And how has that changed over time?
Yeah, I think what the MIF, exactly like you mentioned, works with private sector development, particularly the SME sector. The bank serves larger clients who are seeking out project finance for larger investments and in mining and extractives and other sectors as well. What we are noticing in the region is an increasing knowledge of what it really implies to be connected with your whole supply chain. Kind of like what was just said before. The driver is no longer just a corporate social responsibility factor, but it's increasingly becoming a need for the business. So Cargills, the Mondelez, the Nestle's of the world are not just concerned because they want to make sure that their social impact is there. They're concerned about getting coffee for the next 25 years or cocoa for the next 30 years. And where is this all going to come from? And we talked upstairs about the average age of the coffee farmer being 55. In some places, it's 60 years old. So So what does that tell you about coffee in 20 years, or cocoa for that matter? And so that is an issue. For corporates, it's interesting to see, I think, a trend towards taking this down from the corporate social department down to the supply chain department. And it's interesting to see this as we meet with some of these companies. We're meeting with the supply chain managers, we're meeting with the product buyers, we're meeting with those people who perhaps don't have an edge on social understanding and development goals and all this, but they do have a really good understanding of what they need to get in the next 5 years and the next 10 years. And that has opened a lot of doors, like Bob was saying here. It has opened the doors not just for agencies like ours, it has opened doors for the local governments, for local organizations who are saying, wait, that used to be my territory, working with NGOs and with small farmers. Now I hear these companies and the brokers and the traders also talking the same language. So it's very interesting to see that trend. Traceability is one of the issues. Obviously, you want to know where your bananas are coming from, or where the mangoes are coming from, who's packing them, etc. But it's also a matter of, okay, how can I make sure that I'm going to have mangoes, or quinoa to supply Costco in the next 5 or 10 years? So I think that conversation has opened a lot of doors, and for us it has been something that we have tried to take advantage of and engage different corporates in this aspect of the supply chains.
I want to ask the three of you just a little bit, keying off what Alejandro was talking about, which was this issue of the changing locus of where these conversations are happening. Because, Paul, I get the sense that there may be direction at the top management to say, okay, procurement department, I need you to think about, respond to this change in local laws. Is that an easy thing for you to go talk to your procurement folks and say, hey, isn't this great? The CEO thinks this is important, and for us to do this in Ghana, we're going to have to do X, Y, and Z. Are those folks paid or promoted to kind of help you with what you're trying to do on the ground?
No, but that doesn't mean that you can't have the dialogue and socialize them, right? I mean, I think it's more than just regulatory changes, right? In general, stakeholders, the public, shareholders and others, civil society, expect companies to operate at a level of transparency, right, that we haven't necessarily in the past. And that includes, consumers want to know where that coffee bean comes from. They want to know that their T-shirt was made in a factory where people were getting a fair wage and probably not going to die in a fire, right? And they want to know that your business is delivering value to society, not just value to shareholders. And so I think there has been a societal shift in the expectation of what companies do and how they engage with society that goes beyond the regulatory.
I remember the quote you had from the video we did. Do you remember what it was?
No, but you read it back to me
periodically.
It's very
pithy. It was, business has to be at the table or will be on the menu.
That's right. I mean, and I can't take full credit for that.
But it got my attention. Yeah. It certainly, I remember it.
We will be. I mean, the world has changed. The problems we deal with, as a global society, are way too complicated, way too large for any single sector. We've got to work together. We've got to collaborate, as companies, together with civil society, with bilaterals and others, to figure this out, and government to figure it out. We're not going to solve climate change or income inequality, through grants programs. We've got to figure out how together we can bring all of our core competencies, resources, and skills. And in the case of the private sector, the supply chain is an enormous tool that is now, just beginning to be mined, I think, in this space.
So can I ask both Deirdre and Bob if you could speak to the changing locus of the conversations you've had over time? I think you both referenced it, but I just want to key up sort of Alejandro and Paula's comments about this. So has it gone from sort of the corporate philanthropy or the social investment department, had that, could you talk about how that conversation's evolved?
I think it really depends company to company, who we're talking to and where there's really any impetus to move forward. The thing that I think is interesting is that, yes, procurement has the mandates, but they don't have a budget for SME development. CSR may have a budget for SME development, but they may have other things that are on their mind that they want to do. If you were to look at some of these companies and really create a committee that involves CSR, that involves procurement, that involves security, and we were talking about this upstairs too, is where we're seeing some real pickup is that security is part of the oil companies that does have budgets and that actually is looking to manage risk. And one of the best ways to manage risk is to engage with the community in a different manner and to see a benefit to the local community. And to pick up on something Paula said, probably marketing should be at the table too, in terms of, or public affairs to the table in terms of seeing that we're covering their bases in terms of what's the real messaging that you want to have out about what your company is doing. So I think that it's changing on a company by company basis.
But you're seeing companies doing that in a successful way.
Some of our contracts are out of procurement departments, but they may be out of procurement departments centrally here in the U.S. And then when you get to Mozambique, you may be actually dealing much more with a CSR function there on the ground, or vice versa. So it just gets a little convoluted. There is some change. It's not happening fast enough to really take advantage of the opportunity here and to drive the kind of development we'd like to see driven. But I think that the right company that really takes the lead on integrating those functions in the conversation around local content development is going to be able to take a great leap forward and create a model for other folks.
Bob, you made some reference in your remarks about sort of the changing, evolving. Do you want to just elaborate on that, or you?
I'll just throw another dimension to the locus. What we're finding is often the conversations are really taking place in the field, locally, that the relationships with some of the multinational corporations are really being built from the ground up because there's demands on the day job to see things done, to understand the local context better, to walk through land issues better so that investments don't fail, to recognize that investments of a processing plant with a plantation around it will not be as profitable as one that engages the local farmers. And so we're seeing a lot of the conversations build off of our traditional donor-funded development projects and say, look, we've got to reach out to these communities and we've got to engage these actors.
Can I ask each of you to just talk about the changing legal landscape, and from however you want to react to that? It seems as if, and there are, when I reach out to people in Washington, there does seem to be, there is a subset of energy around sort of tracking that and cataloging that. Could you just talk a little bit from each of your perspectives about, okay, what are you seeing? And certainly you referenced Ghana, but are there some other places where you're seeing this and saying, okay, well, just each of you could just go down the road, because I know that you're each seeing the changing legal landscape. In
general, in the last 6-10 years, I think we've seen a trend, not just in emerging markets, but in countries like the US and the UK and Canada, where there are now regulatory requirements put on companies for things that were once voluntary, whether that's revenue disclosure, right, under Dodd-Frank, but under a myriad regulations, EU directives and national regulations. The UK Modern Slavery Act is now coming online. That is, I don't know if any of you are from companies that do business in the UK, but the bar there is pretty low, and the disclosure very similar to sort of conflict minerals type disclosure. There's the conflict minerals provision of Dodd-Frank. There's the revenue transparency issue put on the extractive industries. That was once a voluntary thing. You join the EITI, right? You work productively across sectors, and it's, everyone's there voluntarily trying to make things better. Well, now that's no longer optional. It's now an SEC disclosure that we're going to have to make, and that's the trend that we're seeing. Things that were considered socially responsible or sustainable are now regulated.
Let me just take advantage of the fact that I'm speaking with you. Just outside of developed countries, how about in the developing world? In addition to, are countries saying, I want to have what Ghana has? I
think countries are saying, we're seeing increased foreign direct investment, whether it's in the extractives or other industries. We'd like our society to benefit as broadly as possible from the presence and from that activity. And while PPPs have done a lot of good in the space of education, access to healthcare, they can't be taken to scale in the same way as the core operations of an enterprise.
You guys, I think, have educated every kid in Equatorial Guinea. Is that true?
Which is lovely.
K through 6.
There's only 10,000
Small country. Good point. 90,000, but point well taken. That's true, but does that mean that they're going to go on and get a job? And but if you invest in in SMEs, if you invest not just in figuring out how to contract with them, which is a transactional thing, but how do you build capacity of small companies to do business with a Chevron, a Hess, an Exxon, a JP Morgan, pick your company, Starbucks, and how do you make sure that they have access to capital as well, that and expertise along the way, so that they actually over time, become very competitive internally and potentially in their region and with multinationals like us.
So talk about the changing legal landscape and how it's driving your business.
So I think there's a couple of things happening. Obviously, the local content laws coming online. Ghana, which is the 90% local content in 10 years law, which is just not achievable. The local content law in Nigeria is a really interesting one, because the minute they implemented it, they wanted 100% local content in a couple of sectors. So 100% local content in welding, which meant that welders in Nigeria can charge whatever they want to do your welding. And
I'm quitting my job here.
And going to weld in Nigeria. And the other thing that they required, I think right off the bat in Nigeria, was inland shipping. All had to be done by Nigerian-captained, Nigerian-owned boats with
Nigerian-bottom boats.
With Nigerian sailors on board, and Nigerians don't do a whole lot of sailing. So it's sort of what comes from that is Uncle Joe has a boat and let's start a company, which is problematic when you put these things into place immediately when those services really are not available in acceptable quantity locally. Other places where legislation is upcoming but not in place, like Mozambique, where that really has driven our business is that Anadarko, 3 years, I think, before final investment decision on their LNG plant there, said, we know local content legislation is coming down the line. We want to be out in front of this, and we want to kind of set the standard for where that legislation is going to go. And so they've invested in building up local suppliers for 3 years before the construction has even begun on that facility. So there's lots of ways that can change, that can change the landscape. I think what's going to be really interesting is to see what happens in the rest of West Africa, where you have new oil presumably coming online if the oil prices get above where they are now, and are those countries, is Liberia, is Sierra Leone going to put in place a reasonable local content law before getting to actual production? And I think that's what we'd surely like to see, and see companies and governments invest in having businesses ready to supply the industry when the industry's ready to purchase.
Bob, can you talk about changing landscape? It doesn't have to be extractives, but in terms of the agricultural space, is there a changing legal landscape? And there's certainly soft demands from consumers saying, I want organic or I want traceability, but is it there's not the same kind of dynamics in the agricultural sector in terms of either how is the regulatory world changing?
From the local perspective, where we see it impact things more is trying to get a handle on importations of seed, of inputs, of fertilizer. So you're looking at protecting natural seeds, you're looking at the GMO question. So you're either making open or closing opportunities for what types of agricultural practices can be practiced, or you're reserving the rights of distribution to a limited either government officials or strictly through government-favored cooperatives, or so that impacts it on that end. And then where you end up with kind of sudden, unpredicted government importation of foodstuffs, which kind of disrupts everything in terms of expectations of those who've been producing.
How about in developed countries? How about where if I go to Whole Foods, is there some laws on the books that's impacting consumers in the UK or the US that you say, oh gosh, this is, and your clients are coming, you saying, oh my gosh, I need to respond to that on the other side in developed countries?
Not that we're seeing with the programs and producers that we're working with.
Okay.
There is one other area that goes more broadly, and that gets in the financing side. We are seeing some of the rollout of the Know Your Customer engagement, creating bureaucratic hurdles that taking some of the laws that our government is promoting in the face of anti-terrorism and anti-money laundering, and being applied in a way that kind of grind things to a halt.
I just wanted to say one last thing on the local content on the extractive side that I think is really interesting is what exactly is local content, which varies so much from country to country. So Equatorial Guinea, I forget what the decree is, but the 51% decree, any company for it to be considered local content has to be a 50% Equatorial Guinean owned company. The other 49% can be owned by whomever, and maybe all that company does is import office supplies from from the U.S., but it counts as local content if a company buys from that. Whereas in another country, like Kazakhstan, the legislation is so unbelievably complex that, if you don't have 1,001% Kazakh employees of the local company, it doesn't count as local content at all. So, that is a very country by country legal definition that, that just complicates this matter.
Thank you. Alejandro, so how's the landscape in the region?
I was just thinking, no, definitely in the extractive industries it's a little different. In agriculture, I would say the big challenge is feeding 9 billion people in the next 10, 15 years, right? So, and we have a decreasing farmer population pretty much all over the place. So it's all about, the conversation is about yields. How can we increase the yields of existing farmers who are already in the farm without expanding farm land area, like in Brazil, for example. So there are some laws in Brazil particularly to protect, to keep some of the Amazon, and so a lot of it is around that. How can we help small farmers, medium-sized farmers, or increase what they're already doing in the amount of land that they have? How can we increase that? And in that regards, there's not laws in the countries that say, oh, you gotta, if you're gonna work with our farmers, you gotta increase their yield by 10%. No, but that is business practice. And that's where all the companies are going. And that's why in the case of coffee, I think it's interesting, and in soybean and other cases, is there's a pre-comparative get-together of companies that say, there's a common issue we've got here. Farmers are only producing 2 tons per hectare. We really need to get to 4. And how can we do this collaboratively? It's not just going to be because he's supplying me. I mean, this is something that's going to affect all of us. And so you see, I think coffee is an example, sugar is another example, where you see some companies working with even local extension agencies, like in the case of Brazil, who are looking at this as a challenge of how can we increase the yields, increase food production without really expanding land necessarily, which is becoming more expensive and less available.
Yeah. So Alejandro, we had a little bit of a conversation about the role of donors and how you see your role and how it's changing. Could you talk a little bit about the role of the MIF? And then I want to ask each of the other panels how they see, whether it's the World Bank or IFC or the IDB or USAID or other bilaterals, what their role is in sort of this changing landscape, because you were talking about that upstairs.
When the MIF started about 20-some years ago, it did a lot of work in microfinance. Microfinance was the solutions, one of the solutions to poverty, right? That transition, then we did a lot of work around SME. And so we try to follow what the stakeholders and the donors of the MIF and what the bank is trying to see are some of the solutions to the issues in the region. And it was finance at that time. It was land tenure also in some aspects. We're seeing the confluence of issues around climate and adaptation and agriculture and food more and more, and energy as well. And so these topics are coming together, and the IDB within the MIF, we're trying to see how with our tools can we adapt and collaborate more and more with companies, like it was said, who probably have more resources, have the people on the ground, and have the connections. How can we work with them in solving some of these issues? So it's no longer, okay, the MIF is going to go do a project in Guatemala and we'll try to fix a situation in the community. No, I mean, it's no longer like that, and I don't think it will ever be like that anymore. It's more like, okay, who's already working there? Who's trading coffee there? Or who has a supply chain that we can talk to that has an interest in having a very positive impact at the yield level? And so those are the kind of conversations that we are seeking out. And so it's not so much anymore the dollars that we can bring in, which it is an important factor, but it's also how can we convene those who are not talking, or perhaps those those local actors who could be brought into the table, be them government or be them private or be in civil society, knowing kind of what the trends are on a more global basis. How can we bring these actors together to address some of these issues? And so that's how we see our role. And we try to use our money to leverage some of that. So as opposed to funding a whole project, which was used to be the old way we would do things. But now is how can we leverage our funds to get in this particular aspect and solve this particular issue in this community.
So Paul, could you talk about how you see the role of outside donors, of AID or official donors, how you see either how you've engaged with them or how you think they ought to be working in this changing landscape?
I mean, I think the power of convening should not be underestimated. I think they have an amazing reach and credibility and ability to convene across sectors. And if we're going to take a cross-sectoral approach, I think they're critical. I also think that, at least in my world, the whole discussion around impact investing and impact bonds and all kinds of different potential financial instruments that are, I think, seen as a panacea, but certainly complementary to grants and loans and other things. I think that the expertise resident in a World Bank, in an IDB, Africa Development Bank, could really help bring what is, an emerging tool into broader use and leverage some of the resources of those institutions to do that.
Okay, Deirdre?
Yeah, I think...
And Pyxera used to get 95% of its monies from...
100%.
100% from ODA, and at last count, Pyxera was what percent?
About 10%.
10%.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. So in 10 years, it went from 100% to 10%. So you still see a role for, and you were talking about this,
Absolutely.
What is the role of donors in this changed landscape?
I think there's a couple of things. One is I described the situation in Ghana where USAID was able to kind of step into a vacuum where the private sector wasn't able to agree in a timely manner, and that hopefully they'll be playing a catalyst role and the private sector will then step in to take this over in the long term. But I think there's also a real opportunity for a USAID to take a lead in something like regional content. So, when you look at places like Equatorial Guinea and Ghana and Nigeria, Sao Tome, if they come online and Sierra Leone, what would happen if we were looking at West Africa regional content instead of local content? There's so many of these services that do not need to be recreated in every single country along the Gulf of Guinea.
How many Sao Tomean welders can you have?
Exactly.
They can go to Nigeria, apparently.
Exactly. There's plenty in Nigeria. So like fabrication. You don't need fabrication in more than one country in the Gulf of Guinea. You don't need steel manufacturing in more than one country. So what could an agency like USAID do to bring the governments to the table to agree on, here's some key services that we really only need one or two of in the Gulf or in East Africa or what have you. I think that is a dream role for me in terms of what a USAID could do.
Bob, what's your donor, how obviously you work a lot with donors, and a lot of your work has been and continues to be with official donors, AID and others. How is their role changing, or how do they see themselves? How do you think they see themselves changing, if at all?
Right, how do I think, since I can't speak on their behalf?
I know I know that.
I think, and you worked with AID, you worked with the GDA,
Yeah.
so this partnership structure. I'm seeing that evolve, sometimes more effectively. And it really comes down to perhaps the evolution that I saw in our own company, where we originally looked at private sector engagement as kind of like a prize. We'd done well in our development work, in our management strengthening work, in our community development work, well enough that every so often we could sell something to a bigger player. So there's a certain sense of, wait, we got Pepsi on this, we got someone on this, and that's good enough. So it becomes like a gold star. That's not going to work. But I also see the corporations approaching some of these partnerships in the same way. We reached out to, we're working in Liberia. We reached out to some of the multinational firms that have concessions in the palm oil industry. And they've got their community development pot of money. And they wanted to figure out how they could tap a GDA opportunity to subsidize their community development money. And AID wanted to get a corporation on, and trying to get both parties to really see, saying that this is your own little thing that's getting a cross-subsidy one way or the other isn't going to work. You really need to look at leveraging. And the 5 of you with concessions here should look at leveraging, because all of you have agreements that you will have a zero carbon impact in your work in developing plantations in palm oil. How can you do that without engaging the local communities? How can you do it without wasting scarce resources between the 5 of you, and how can you leverage the donors? So being able to look, to really say, we can't scope our activities based on our budgets alone. We need to be able to scope our activities based on our shared objectives, pool our resources, and really leverage effectively. And the more we make progress that way, the better we will.
Okay. Well, I want to hear from a number of different folks in the audience, so I'd love to hear from somebody from Chevron. I'd love to hear from Santiago, and I'd love to hear from my friend Dave as well. But I'm just going to let you guys, the 3 of you, think about it. But I'm going to ask for hands in the meantime, but I'm going to come back to these three people or organizations. So anyone want to start this? Otherwise, yes. Yes, please. I'm going to give you the microphone. Yeah, give it this woman, please. Yeah, and then her first. Ladies first.
Ladies first. I'm Melanie Bixby, U.S. Pakistan Women's Council. It's a partnership between the State Department and American University with the Diaspora. We just brought 4 companies aboard as members: Coke, Pepsi, Procter & Gamble, local company Engro. We're looking at increasing hiring diversity and supply chain diversity, gender diversity. And we're looking where to start. We just brought them aboard in October after, of course, the 9-month vetting process. And P&G is quite forward-leaning. They say that they procure regionally and globally chemically engineered projects. They're not going to look at women's SMEs. We do have centers that train women's SMEs, so donors do build the capacity, and that's a great role. But we're looking, how do you connect the dots? I like what you had said, Deirdre, about the committees. Get a committee with the CSR person, the procurement person, the marketing person, and I'm trying to think sort of where we start. We asked them if they would, women have a hard time accessing tenders. SMEs, they don't know where they're advertised, how to do it, how to network. So we were thinking about having the companies go to these women entrepreneur centers, give a presentation how to do business with us, and just start the conversation organically.
Okay, great.
Any sort of help or suggestion?
Comments on that, and this gentleman here. I'll get these 2, and then I want to give Santiago the floor. Sir.
Okay, thank you. I'm John Harrington. I'm with ExxonMobil.
Oh, great.
And first of all, I want to compliment CSIS and Chevron for convening this discussion. This is globally such an important and dynamic area that all of us are operating in, and I think it needs more attention. 2 things that are going on that weren't raised, I just wanted to advise folks, for those that didn't know. The OECD is finishing up a 2-year exercise to develop guidelines, or what they call an operational framework, for countries to consider and for companies investing in countries to consider as to how to go about doing this. And the foundation of it is to do it in a collaborative manner and not in a confrontational manner, because this is something that we do, at least as a company, and I know most of our peers, routinely and deliberately and increasingly well, because we want to have more of a local workforce and a local supply chain just as much as the government does. What the tension comes in is the pace and how fast and how effective it can be. But the objectives really are the same. And so the OECD is looking at this. IPECA, which is an international oil and gas association that looks at socioeconomic and environmental standards, is just finishing writing a rather thick guide for companies to use to do this. So those 2 initiatives also just illustrate the extent to which this is becoming a normal part of business, in addition to becoming a growing mandate. Just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Let me just get reactions to, and then this woman here. Next to Mike. Yeah.
We have a little nucleus going on right here.
Okay, yeah.
I'm Laura Rosen with the International Youth Foundation. I would like to nudge the conversation back towards the SDGs. One of the things we haven't talked about a lot is the fact that in order to achieve some of these local content goals, you have to have the pipeline, the stream of the capable talent to do it, and all of the other access issues that come with it. If we're trying to, for example, increase productivity or increase yields of existing farms, how much of that issue is about gender inequity in terms of access to land or technology or capital, or the fact that the average age of a farmer is 60 years old, that youth are not moving into this sector? How much of this discussion can we link back to advancing some of those other SDGs at the same time? Because it really needs to be, the dots need to be connected here.
All 17 of them.
Yes.
And
For
169
starters.
And 169 sub-indicators. Okay, let me just take those three. So I'd ask the panelists just to respond to comments or questions that were put by these three folks. So Deirdre, why don't I start with you?
Sorry, did you say Melanie? Yes. Okay, so let me throw out a couple thoughts about Melanie's question. The one thing you said about having these companies come in and actually meet with women's organizations and talk with them very specifically about their procurement policies and how they could meet their requirements, I think is a really good one. We have not worked on that specifically as relates to women-owned businesses, but certainly within local content for the oil and gas industry, we often are bringing in folks from industry to actually provide direct assistance and training to potential suppliers, particularly around health, safety, and environment standards, which are just at the top of the list of what they're going to have to meet in order to do that, and we've seen that work really well. But I'm going to throw out something completely different, and that is one of the areas that we work in is what we call global pro bono, or international corporate volunteer programs. And actually some of the, PepsiCo is one of our big clients in that space, as well as 15 or 20 others. And I think there's a real opportunity in that space that hasn't been exploited yet, which is to take top talent from big multinational organizations that are looking at how to localize their supply chains and embed them in local businesses so that they actually understand the challenges that those businesses face in their daily operations, so that they could better understand from a business perspective on how on how to localize. And I think that kind of insight, both for the employees of the multinational buyer, is huge in terms of seeing the day-to-day roadblocks these businesses face, and how they might break down some of those roadblocks internally to better be able to procure locally. And then also for those local businesses to really have access to skills that may be able to see their business in a different way, that it can be sometimes just small tweaks that can all of a sudden make them an acceptable supplier. So that would be one big suggestion I would have.
Other responses to some of the comments or questions from the...
I'd point you to two documents, one that's recently released, which I referenced already, which was the Partnership for Global Equity. They just came out with their findings on their assessment of the importance of gender equity and the relevance of gender inequity in the coffee sector, and prescribed ways to move forward from a corporate perspective. And another one that should be coming out, USAID funded 3 programs in 3 different parts of the world under an umbrella called Women's Leadership in SME Development. And there's been some postings, and it's been done in a very structured way, where there was a significant amount of monitoring the impact of different types of interventions with women. So they may have done mentoring programs, they may be forming associations, they may have funded grants, they may have had learning experiences or exposures to international volunteers, or and basically trying to compare across and see which of those demonstrated a greater impact I think in India, Peru, and Kyrgyzstan, so 3 different parts of the world. But they're compiling that now, so it will be coming.
Other comments from? Okay.
Just back to the SDGs, because that's something that I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, I don't know that local content in and of itself is going to fully address that. Someone else has to work as part of the plan on the skills gap, on how do you prepare youth appropriately for the jobs of the 21st century, whether they sit in New York City or Kampala, right? And that is, I think local content is a piece. It might be a driver to show what's possible in terms of economic development, but that talent pipeline is really critical, and I don't know quite how to bring that in, but some smart person needs to figure that out.
I want to bring my friend Santiago Sadaka into the conversation. Mike, can you? So thanks for coming. Santiago is the CEO of Karana, but now part of the Futures Group, and been one of the great innovators on this topic, so thanks for being here.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm laughing about a conversation that we had in a setting like this about 2 years ago, which was in relation to WTO rules, and I remember talking about this dynamic about the need for corporations to be required by local governments to be doing X, Y, Z. And there were a whole bunch of trade eggheads in the room, and we have a whole bunch of them inside Corona and now Palladium. And basically, I was laughed out of the room because that doesn't happen according to WTO rules, right? Of course, that's not the real world case, but that's a situation that we're dealing with. And we're dealing with it not just because of the legal requirements and not just because of what's been appropriately talked about in terms of the local interest, but because of what Alejandro is talking about, which is there are business requirements that move companies to have to improve the quality, the quantity, and the constancy of product that they're getting from different developing countries. And having worked with companies from Walmart, which is very interested in the workforce development issues, to PepsiCo, which is interested in the quality of the potatoes that they get for potato chips, and run the gamut. One of the learnings that we developed, and I will make a very strong statement, is that I think the development community is good at having these sorts of chats, and we're developing very good offerings, I think, in improving the capability of cooperatives, SMEs, and others to be able to be integrated into the value chains. What we found, and I think Deirdre and a couple of you all addressed this, is that oftentimes, I'll just say it, companies are not very good at knowing how to change their business processes. And as Corona, one of the reasons why we just 3 months ago decided to merge with the Palladium group of companies is because one of the things that we kept on hitting against was the fact that we were often having very good conversations with procurement managers or very good conversations with presidents of SAB in Uganda, or very good conversations at the C-level of a very important corporation, but they didn't know how to change as a corporation their buying habits, their production habits, their incentive structures to actually make the sort of change that is going to be transformative for the world in light of the SDGs. So our attempt now is not only we're continuing to work with the communities and the beneficiaries that we all want their lives to improve, but one of our very significant product offerings now is through the Palladium Corporate Scorecard and other types of business strategy tools, is to teach corporations how they can change the way in which they implement this new strategy. People buy the fact now that they need to change their business processes. That was very well said. But how do you do that? And just like the development community has to learn and is not very good at many things, corporations, frankly, are not very good at this. And so I think that is what, you talked about 3 stages. I think this is the 4th stage of supply chain development and transformation that is going to take place.
Could I just ask folks to just respond to Santiago's comments? Because I completely agree with what Santiago just said. Paul, could I just...
I'm in violent agreement. I think it is very difficult for any institution to change the way it does business, whether it's the U.S. government, Hess Corporation, an NGO. It's very difficult. People, particularly in supply chain, they're well-intentioned people. They want to do a good job. But to your point, the job they're being asked to do may be different from the reality they're going to have to do, right? And so they don't have the tools. They may not have the skills to change the way they do their supply chain or any aspect of their business. And so that sounds like a great business opportunity.
Alejandro, do you want to respond to that?
Figured that was coming, but.
It's something that we've observed in the field is that corporates have been hiring people who have worked in NGOs or are familiar with this to bring them on board because they don't know. I mean, sort of how do you relate? How do you act out a project without offending or being respectful of what the community is trying to do. So all these things, I mean, and so I've seen that dynamic interesting. I'm surprised by the fact that some of the staff members that I meet in these corporates are either agronomists or sociologists, people who have a little more exposure in this area. So that, that's one tactic, but I think the commitment that you mentioned needs to be there. Without the commitment of the company, without the outspoken commitment to do this or to spend resources in this, there's very little that middle management will do or supply chain managers will do it.
I wanted to hear from my friends at Chevron.
Thanks so much for this panel. It was very, very fascinating. And one thing that we've been talking a lot about at Chevron is as well as how to bring the whole of business to some of these development goals and how do you really think about your entire economic footprint in a community, is how do you also bring some of those, the rest of your corporate responsibility policies as well, especially in regards to human rights and some of those other corporate responsibility commitments. So if you are going to be expanding out into your supply chain to those local communities, how do you make sure that in addition to, Deirdre, you mentioned health and safety standards, that you are also spreading some of those other good practices. So that's something I'd like to hear some comments about from the panel.
Great. I want to hear from my friend David Boyer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To piggyback on what was shared about the business processes and the challenges around that, Paula, you mentioned Dodd-Franks, and I was curious to know, because now they impose, you don't have any changes, the days of volunteering are over. How do you audit, how do you get behind it and make sure that you are in compliance and you're meeting those governance? Because now you have these rules of engagement that you didn't have before.
Yeah, particularly on revenue transparency, for us to disclose, and that'll be determined in the US by the SEC, right, requirement, is one piece of the equation. If governments are also not disclosing and there's no reconciliation, the disclosure is kind of, it's meaningless in some ways. You see how much we've transferred maybe in taxes or royalty payments or what have you, but if the government isn't, also disclosing its revenue side, that's difficult. I don't mean to say that initiatives like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative are dead or don't have a place, because I think they do. One thing the EITI does, for example, is help governments sit at the table and figure things out and provide the kind of technical assistance they may need and convening that they may need to be able to effectively disclose revenue and convene people around an issue from different sectors. When it's just becoming a regulatory disclosure, you figure out what the rules say and look at the forms and fill them out and verify, audit, do your due diligence, and call it a day. And it seems to me like you're losing something there, right? And it's that piece where you're actually building capacity to change, in this case, a business process that a government has, right?
So can I get other comments from the panel?
Yeah, I want to go back to this, to the SDGs a little bit, to both you and the question that was asked before, because it's also something I've invested a lot of time into, just knowing what the 17 are, let alone anything else.
There will be a test at the end of this
panel.
Exactly.
Quiz.
And the one thing that I really think we have to be very, very careful about, and especially the private sector, is not treating the SDGs as a checklist.
Right.
That's sort of, yeah, we're doing something on gender, we're doing something on education, we're doing something on employment opportunities. Hey, we're doing all 17. We have a partnership too, so great. And I feel like that's a little bit of what's going on this front end, and I've heard from a lot of colleagues in the private sector that they've gone down their checklist and said, oh, we're already well on our way. And so what I think is a more compelling way to go about figuring out how the SDGs interact with your business is to really look at what is a critical problem that our business thinks needs solving that is directly related to our success as a business, and what are all the moving parts of that problem, and let's invest in that one thing. So one example, and Dan, you've done a lot of work, and you probably brought this to my attention more than anyone else, but is post-harvest loss. So Alejandro, you talked about increasing yields, but the other thing that's really the other side of that equation is reducing loss, and post-harvest loss is a totally solvable problem. It needs a whole lot of investment. It needs all of the right partners on the same page and really collaborating together in a very complicated way. But if you say, I want to feed more people, I want to reduce post-harvest loss, then you can bring everything together, and then you can address the gender inequality issue within the post-harvest loss question. You can address the skills gap issue within the post-harvest loss question. And so taking a little bit more of a simplified look at the SDGs and not saying I have to do something about everyone, but I have to solve one problem, I think is one thing. And the last thing I want to say on that is on the SDGs, and I see Laura from my office in there, you don't happen to have any SDG pictures, do you? One thing we did was to take the 17 SDGs and we literally cut them up into strips, took all the associated 169 indicators to try and figure out where these things all fit together. This is maybe not a perfect illustration, but we fit them into.
Is it like a beautiful mind picture?
It is a beautiful mind. My office looked more like my children had been in there doing arts and crafts, but we separated it into 4 main areas, all of which overlap. And that's the problem, is everyone's trying to look at all these issues in a silo. So it's health, education and employment and economic opportunity, human and natural environment, and human rights. With partnership as sort of the anchor in the center, the 17th goal being something that's the enabler for everything. So if it's useful for you to look at it, we have it on our website, or Laura may have some over there that we can hand out, but it might be just a simplified way to say, this is what's important to our business.
Other comments?
No, I would reinforce, and I think it's linked, it's a similar message, it's not looking to see, are we out of bounds? It's what you're doing while you're in bounds. And an important element of that is what matters to us and what impact can we have. And the more you're aligning your energies in that area with how you measure success, you've got a virtual circle going there. Otherwise it becomes check the box.
Other comments? This gentleman.
Thank you to the panelists. My name is Zachary Kaplan. I'm the director of DAI's Energy and Resources Group. Thank you for all the comments today. One thing that I wanted to bring up, coming back to the topic of localization of supply chain, local content, and what I think anybody who's worked in this space can attest to is the complete dearth of good analytics and information about where the opportunities lie. And that informs all levels, from whether you are the implementer of a program around enterprise development, whether you're a government setting policy, regulation, and schedules, whether you are a supply chain manager in a particular company, knowing what is realistic. As it was mentioned, I haven't seen a local content law, bill, regulation to pick on sub-Saharan Africa in the last 5 years where anybody looks at it and says, okay, we can do this. Right. Nigeria is held up very often. It is unbelievably aggressive, and bad laws and policies are more detrimental in many ways than no laws and policies. Mm-hmm. So where's the failure there? Is it because the governments just want to push companies? To a degree, yes, and to a degree, no. What these governments are not being informed by strong analytics. Most of the analysis around local content is qualitative at best and anecdotal. I worked in South Africa. We accelerated a particular fabricator. He or she went from doing $1 million a year to $25 million a year. Success. Now let's scale that up, and let's do that across the whole supply chain. There are some hard truths and facts when you actually put numbers, and we invest quite a bit of our own time into these analytics and to these models to say, where are the opportunities in the supply chain? And equally important, how big are these? What are the procurement trends? Because we know investment, it goes up, and operations. Oil and gas is not a labor-intensive industry, it's a capital-intensive industry. Counter that with mining, which it can actually be the opposite in some ways at the operational stage. So saying where the opportunities are and when those opportunities will occur and when they will drop off, I think is important for all the stakeholders involved, whether it's the public sector, whether it's civil society and managing expectations, because they see ExxonMobil and Chevron and Hess come in and think multi-billion-dollar companies, right. Everybody gets a job, everybody has an SME. To the government, to the actual companies setting their own targets on how they're going to meet those, and then properly investing, whether it's CSR money or wherever that funding comes from, whether it's USAID, the World Bank, IFC, or your own money, properly and best appointing that money to where you'll get the best value added, because at the end of the day, local content is about the value add.
Great, thank you very much. I'll give you the last word because we're gonna wrap it up after this. This gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Gustavo Delgado, and I'm a private consultant. And my question follows up on that. So it seems to me, to a greater or lesser extent, we're living through a technological age in which reference points and language and symbolism and metrics are all being challenged. And so my question is, and it follows up also on the comment that Santiago makes, is it just do you see a difference in the way technology companies and heavy analytic companies are approaching the issue as opposed to more legacy companies, whether it's extraction or whether it's agriculture? Technology companies often come across either as completely uninterested in social issues or completely overconfident that technology will solve them all. And so my question is, the question that's just asked, like, you could design a program that basically like does the analytics and incorporates the local supply and the SDGs, and it just becomes a more complicated algorithm, and you get the result you're looking for. Technology can go way out on that space, and yet the conversation that the group has been having doesn't seem to be incorporating or going in that technology space. And so I know that may not be the most coherent comment, but it just seems to me that you could either think that technologists don't really care, and so technology companies aren't really involved in the space, or you could believe that technology can solve this in a relatively ambitious and much quicker way.
Thank you. Okay, so responses to either the questions or comments? Yes, Alejandro.
I mean, it's kind of broad to say technology will solve. I think there are a lot of really interesting applications that some of these companies are using for the purpose of what was mentioned before, of getting those analytics. And I think they need to be scaled. I think you're right. I think there needs to be attention. If you're going to commit to do this, then you do need to get the analytics. And I think there is a need for it. I think there's a lot of technologies out there that are developed, that are serving that purpose, certainly for the traceability aspects and for knowing where the products are from. And that has become much more common. But I think for some of the other issues that you think that you mentioned, there's still a wide gap, and that probably still needs to be addressed.
Okay. Any other comments from the panel?
I think just in addition, another barrier to local content is the, a home country regulatory regime, right? I mean, we have to comply with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We have to comply with a whole range of transparency and governance requirements. And sometimes, even if you have the best possible legislation and the best possible environment to hire locally, sometimes you can't. It's really hard to find a company that you can do business with and comply with your home country laws. So that's, I think, just another thing to add.
Well, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it, and please join me in thanking the panel.